It started small, almost like a trick of the eye. The first time I saw him, I was walking home from work, just like any other day. The streets were busy with people hurrying to get home before dark. I remember glancing across the street, and there he was. A man standing perfectly still, his eyes fixed on me. At first, I didn't think much of it. People watch others all the time, right? But there was something about him, something off. He just stood there, too still, too focused. I looked away, telling myself I was being paranoid, but when I glanced back, he was gone. The whole thing should have ended there, just a passing moment in a crowded city. But it didn't. The next time I saw him was a few days later at the grocery store. I was standing in the produce aisle, checking for ripe apples, when I caught him again out of the corner of my eye. That same man, wearing the same plain clothes, staring at me from across the aisle. I felt my heart skip a beat, but when I looked directly at him, nothing. Just another shopper going about their business. I tried to shake it off, but as the days passed he kept appearing, always at the edge of my vision, always watching. On the bus, outside my building. Once, I saw him standing on the opposite sidewalk from my apartment, staring up at my window. Each time, it felt like he was getting closer. But the strangest part? No one else ever seemed to notice him. I'd look around, desperate for some kind of validation, but people walked by him without so much as a glance, like he wasn't even there. I started questioning myself, wondering if I was losing my mind. Who was this man? Why was he always there, lingering, like a shadow I couldn't shake? It wasn't long before I learned his name. Henry. I don't know how I knew it. It just came to me, like a whisper at the back of my mind. Henry's appearances didn't stop. If anything, they became more frequent. At first, it was just in public places, the street, the grocery store, the park. But then he started getting closer. I'd look out my window at night, and there he'd be, standing on the sidewalk, staring up at me. His face was always partially hidden by shadows, but I could feel his eyes locked on mine. The worst part was, it didn't matter where I was. Henry found a way to be there. One day, I was at work, trying to lose myself in the endless stream of emails, when I felt that familiar chill. I glanced up from my desk, and there he was, standing outside the office building. Just standing, like he had all the time in the world. He never came in, never did anything, just watched. My coworkers didn't seem to notice. I even asked one of them if they saw the man outside, but they just shrugged, said they didn't know what I was talking about. Then it got worse. Much worse. I started hearing things in my apartment at night. Soft creaks, the rustle of fabric, like someone was moving through the rooms when I knew I was alone. I'd sit up in bed, heart pounding, convinced that Henry had somehow gotten inside, but every time I checked, the doors were locked. Nothing was out of place. Still, I could feel him. He was close, too close. One night I woke up and saw him standing outside my bedroom window. But here's the thing, I live on the 3rd floor. There's no balcony, no fire escape, nothing he could have been standing on. And yet he was there, pressed against the glass, watching me as I slept. I screamed, ran to the window, but by the time I reached it, he was gone. Like he'd never been there. I tried telling people, my friends, my family. I explained how Henry was always around, how he'd been following me for weeks, showing up in places no one else could. But they all had the same response. I was overworked, stressed out, imagining things. Take a break, they'd say. Get some rest. You're probably just seeing things that aren't there. I wanted to believe them, I really did. But how could I, when I knew deep down that Henry was real? He wasn't a figment of my imagination. He was there, and he wasn't going away. Each time I saw him, the knot in my stomach tightened, the creeping doubt growing stronger. Was I going crazy, or was Henry slowly driving me there? Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. I couldn't take it anymore. Henry was consuming my every thought. I felt like I was being hunted, but no one believed me. I knew I had to find answers, to figure out who, or what Henry really was. So I started digging. Old newspapers, online forums, anything I could get my hands on. I spent hours scrolling through stories of missing people, strange occurrences, and urban legends. At first, it felt like I was grasping at straws. Nothing concrete. Nothing that pointed to him. But then I found something. It was a forum post from about 10 years ago. A woman was describing a man who had been following her, watching her from the shadows. She wrote that his name was Henry, though she couldn't explain how she knew that. The description fit him perfectly, the way he would appear out of nowhere, how no one else seemed to notice him. She said she had told her friends and family, but they dismissed her concerns, just like mine had. Her post ended abruptly. No follow-up, no conclusion. I tried to find more about her, social media, any mention in the news, but she seemed to have vanished. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened to her. And she wasn't the only one. The more I searched, the more stories I found. Different people, all from my town, describing encounters with a man named Henry. And each story ended the same way. Without closure, the person just disappeared. The dates of these disappearances went back decades, and I started to realize something horrifying. Henry wasn't human. He couldn't be. How else could he still be around after all these years, preying on people like me? I felt sick. My chest tightened as I pieced it all together. He wasn't just some stalker. Henry was something far more sinister, something ancient, maybe even supernatural. And for some reason, he had chosen me as his next target. But the worst discovery didn't come from the internet. It came from my own home. Little things started to change. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid, imagining things. But I began to notice objects out of place. My keys, which I always left on the kitchen counter, were suddenly on the coffee table. My closet door, which I always shut before bed, would be slightly ajar in the morning. And it wasn't just once or twice. It was happening regularly, like someone had been there while I was away. I couldn't shake the feeling that Henry had been inside my house, that he had touched my things, invaded my space. The idea sent shivers down my spine. I changed the locks, added extra security, but it didn't matter. Henry was always one step ahead. He was in my life, in my home, and I had no idea how to stop him. Each night, I went to bed wondering if he'd be watching me while I slept. The nightmare felt more real than anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't like the usual dreams, disjointed, hazy. This one was vivid, like I was trapped inside my own mind, and Henry was there with me. I found myself standing in my childhood home, a place I hadn't thought about in years. The air was thick with that familiar, suffocating dread I'd come to associate with Henry. I walked through the darkened halls, my footsteps echoing in the silence. And then there he was, standing in the living room, waiting for me. For the first time he spoke. "You've forgotten, Sarah," he said, his voice low and calm, as if we were old friends. But I haven't. I tried to speak, to ask him what he meant, but my throat was tight, like something was squeezing the words out of me. He stepped closer, his face finally visible, pale, expressionless, his eyes dark pools of emptiness. "I chose you for a reason. You think you've repressed it, but it's always been there. I've always been there." Suddenly, images flashed in my mind, moments I didn't remember, or maybe I had just buried them deep. A memory of myself as a child, standing in that very living room, hearing whispers, seeing a figure in the shadows. Henry had been with me even then, a presence lurking just beyond my understanding. And now, after all these years, he was back. I woke up with a start, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The nightmare clung to me, its weight pressing down on my chest. But something else was wrong, something in the waking world. I glanced at my bedside table and saw a piece of paper, folded neatly, sitting where I always left my phone. With trembling hands, I picked it up and unfolded it. The handwriting was mine, but I had no memory of writing the words scrawled across the page. "You can't escape me, Sarah. I'm part of you." The room spun around me, a wave of nausea rising in my throat. Had I written that, in my sleep, or was Henry controlling me in ways I didn't even understand? That was it. I couldn't live like this anymore. I had to end it. I had to confront him, force him out of the shadows, make him reveal himself to others, make them believe. I couldn't be the only one to see him anymore. The next day I began planning. I knew Henry always appeared when I was alone, so I needed to make sure someone else would be there watching. I set up cameras in my apartment, rigging them to capture every angle, every corner. I kept my phone nearby, ready to record anything strange. But I also needed someone I trusted to witness it with their own eyes. I called my friend Lily and convinced her to stay with me that night. She didn't believe me, of course, but she agreed to humor me, probably thinking it would help ease my paranoia. But I knew better. I wasn't paranoid. Henry was real, and I was going to prove it. That night, as we sat in my living room, the air felt electric, like something was about to happen. My heart pounded in my chest, my eyes constantly darting to the windows, the doors, waiting for Henry to show himself. Lily sat beside me, scrolling through her phone, oblivious to the tension radiating through me. Hours passed and nothing happened. I started to doubt myself. Maybe this was all in my head. Maybe I was losing it after all. But just as I was about to give up, I felt it, a presence cold and heavy filling the room. I turned to the window, and there he was. Henry, standing just outside, his face pressed against the glass, staring straight at me. I gasped, grabbing Lily's arm. "Do you see him? Please tell me you see him." Lily looked up confused. "What are you talking about? There's no one there." I stood up, my breath shallow. "He's right there. How can you not see him?" But Henry just stood there, his gaze locked on mine, and I realized the horrifying truth. No one else would ever see him. Henry wasn't just a man. He was something deeper, something tied to me. The moment finally came when I couldn't take it anymore. It was just me and him. Henry, standing in my living room waiting. Lily had left hours ago, frustrated and tired of my frantic insistence that Henry was there, even though she couldn't see him. Now it was just the two of us. No cameras, no witnesses, just the truth that I had been chasing. I stood in front of him, my body trembling with fear and rage. "Who are you?" I screamed, my voice breaking. "Why are you doing this to me? What do you want?" He didn't answer right away. He just stared, his cold, emotionless eyes locked onto mine. And then, slowly, he smiled, a cruel, knowing smile that sent chills down my spine. "I've always been here, Sarah," he whispered, his voice low, almost tender. "You've known me for a long time. You just chose to forget." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was saying. How could he have always been here? Who was he really? I took a step back, shaking my head. "No, that's not possible. You're lying. I don't know you. I don't." But deep down, a part of me knew the truth. It had been there all along, lurking in the shadows of my mind, just like Henry. Memories I had buried long ago, fragments of something I had never wanted to face. He stepped closer, closing the space between us. I could feel his presence, heavy and suffocating. "You can't run from me, Sarah. I'm a part of you. I always have been." And that's when it hit me, the horrifying realization that Henry wasn't a stranger at all. He wasn't some external force, some stalker or ghost haunting me. He was me, a twisted, fragmented piece of my mind, something I had locked away years ago, only to have it resurface now, stronger than ever. I collapsed to the floor, my mind unraveling, the lines between reality and madness blurring beyond recognition. I had spent so long trying to escape Henry, to make sense of his presence, but now I knew there was no escaping him. He wasn't some outside threat. He was inside me, always had been. A shadow of myself, something I had repressed but could never truly erase. The next thing I remember is the sound of sirens. My neighbors must have called the police when they heard me screaming. They found me there, huddled on the floor, sobbing, shaking, pointing to the spot where Henry stood. But when the officers arrived, they didn't see him. Of course they didn't. To them, I was just another woman losing her mind, ranting about a man who wasn't there. They tried to calm me down, but I couldn't stop screaming at Henry, begging him to leave me alone. But he didn't. He just stood there, watching, smiling. They took me away in handcuffs, saying something about getting me help. I barely heard them. My eyes were fixed on Henry, who followed closely behind, always just out of sight of the others. Even as they led me into the back of the police car, I could still feel his presence, his cold breath on the back of my neck. As the doors closed and the car pulled away, I glanced out the window and there he was, sitting next to me, calm and quiet, his smile never fading. I realize now there's no escape. Wherever I go, whatever happens to me, Henry will always be there. He's not some figment of my imagination. He's a part of me, a dark, twisted part of my soul that I can't run from. And no one else will ever see him but me.